Police sirens pierced the silence of the Pico neighborhood, one of the poorest areas of Santa Monica. Rain pounded the asphalt, turning puddles into dirty pools under the dim light of street lamps. Police quickly cordoned off a dilapidated three-story house that looked more like a barracks. Neighbors in worn bathrobes and home clothes crowded around the entrance, despite the downpour and late hour. Patrol Officer Marcus Wilson, the first to arrive at the scene, stood at the door of apartment number 27 on the second floor. His face was tense, and his hand nervously stroked his holster. He had already seen what was inside. The dispatcher received a call at 11:15 p.m., he reported to the detective who had just arrived. A woman's voice reported a murder, gave this address, and hung up. Detective Jamal Banks nodded, shaking raindrops from his worn raincoat. At 45, he had seen enough dead bodies not to rush to see another one. His tired eyes scanned the dirty hallway with peeling paint before he stepped into the apartment. The smell was the first thing that hit his nose, a mixture of gunpowder, blood, and fear. The small living room had a worn sofa and an ancient television in the corner. On the floor lay the body of a middle-aged man, dark-skinned and heavily built. Blood had spread across the cheap linoleum, soaking into the worn carpet. Lamont Jackson lay on his back, his eyes frozen in a look of surprise. His white t-shirt, once white, was now soaked with blood from multiple wounds in his chest. In the corner of the room, a woman sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her gaze was fixed on the void, and her body was trembling slightly. Jamal knew immediately that this was Keisha Jackson, the deceased's wife. Next to her on the floor lay a small .38 caliber pistol, a classic choice for self-defense. "Mrs. Jackson?" Banks called softly, crouching down in front of her. "Can you hear me?" The woman slowly turned her head. Her eyes were dry but filled with such pain that the detective involuntarily recoiled. "I killed him," she whispered in a colorless voice. "I killed Lamont." Jamal nodded to the medical examiner who had just entered the room and turned to the patrolman. "Call for another car. She needs to be taken to the station." While the examiner was working on the body, Banks began to examine the crime scene. 8 shell casings, a full magazine. All the bullets had been fired into the victim's chest and stomach. The shooter had been close, no more than 2 meters away. There were no signs of a struggle, except for an overturned chair and a broken cup in the kitchen. On the coffee table lay a stack of utility bills and a reminder of an overdue rent payment. In the corner stood an old wardrobe with several photographs, Keisha and Lamont on their wedding day, apparently 5 years ago. They were smiling. She was in a simple white dress. He was in a cheap suit with a boutonniere. Next to it was a more recent photograph of a teenage girl in a prom dress. "Daughter?" Jamal asked one of the officers, pointing to the photo. "Yes, Chanel Jackson, 18 years old. Keisha's daughter from her first marriage. According to the neighbors, she's working the night shift at a 24-hour store 2 blocks from here." Banks nodded and continued his search. The bedroom was a mess. Drawers pulled out, clothes scattered everywhere. In the bathroom were bottles of cheap cosmetics, expired medications, and worn towels. A typical scene for a family barely making ends meet. "Detective!" one of the officers called to him. "I think you should see this." An open envelope lay on the kitchen table. Inside was a medical report from a free clinic in Santa Monica. Banks put on gloves and carefully removed the document. Patient, Keisha Jackson. HIV test, positive. The date was yesterday's. By this time, Keisha had already been taken out of the apartment. Jamal stepped out onto the landing, where several neighbors were waiting to share what they knew, a common occurrence in neighborhoods like this, where any drama becomes entertainment. Mrs. Brooks, an elderly African-American woman with gray braids, lived in the apartment across the hall. "They were always arguing, Detective," she said eagerly, adjusting her slipping robe. "Especially in the last few months. He came home late, often drunk. She screamed, accused him of all kinds of things. Poor woman, she was supporting the whole family." "Did you hear the argument today?" asked Banks, taking out his notebook. "You bet. At first it was quiet. Then she started screaming something about illness, about death. He replied that it wasn't his fault. Then there was silence and then shots. Lots of shots. A young guy was standing nearby in a t-shirt despite the chill. Lamont was no good as a husband. he added. I saw him with other women, more than once, and not just one. The other neighbors nodded in agreement. The story was a familiar one: an unfaithful husband, a tormented wife, a sudden discovery that pushed her over the edge. Back in the apartment, Banks noticed a woman's purse lying by the door. With the expert's permission, he examined its contents. In addition to the usual women's items, there were several receipts from the Sunset Inn motel on the outskirts of town. The dates varied over the last 2 months, and there was another find, a folded note on pink paper. Lamont, baby, thanks for last night. You know how to make a woman happy. You're Roxy. As Lamont Jackson's body was loaded into the coroner's van, Jamal noticed a crowd gathering around the police car where Keisha was sitting. He moved closer. It's her, whispered the neighbors. She shot her husband. It was about time, muttered someone in the crowd. Banks looked at the woman through the car window. Keisha sat upright, staring ahead. In the light of the flashing lights, her face looked like a mask. No tears, no remorse, just the endless exhaustion of someone who had reached the end of their rope. At the station, Keisha sat in the interrogation room, wrapped in a gray blanket. The shock gradually receded, giving way to the realization of what had happened. When Banks entered, she didn't even look up. Mrs. Jackson, I need to ask you a few questions, he began, turning on the tape recorder. Do you understand your rights? You don't have to answer without a lawyer. I don't need a lawyer, Keisha replied quietly. I'll tell you everything. Her story was simple. Lamont worked as a stocker at a supermarket, and she was a cleaner there. They met 6 years ago and got married a year later. At first, everything was fine, but then the problems started. He began drinking, staying out all night and coming home with different women. He didn't bring home money regularly, spending most of it on booze and his own entertainment. Yesterday, I got the results of my medical exam, Keisha continued in an even voice. I have HIV. I've always been faithful. He's the only one who could have infected me. Her hands clenched into fists. When he came home tonight, I showed him the report. Do you know what he said? He laughed. He said I must have picked it up somewhere because no one would even want to fuck someone like me. And then he admitted that he'd known about his diagnosis for a long time. He knew and still slept with women. With me. Her voice faltered, but she controlled herself. He went to the kitchen to get a beer, and I remembered his gun. Lamont kept it in the nightstand by his bed for protection, he said. I took it and shot him. The whole magazine. I don't remember how many times. I don't remember anything except his laughter. Banks wrote down her statement. The story sounded plausible, especially given the evidence found, the note from his mistress, the motel receipts, the test results. A classic case of being pushed to the brink. Did you know about his affairs? About specific women? Asked the detective. I suspected. Sometimes I smelled other women's perfume, found traces of lipstick, but he always denied everything, accused me of being paranoid. As he left the room, Jamal bumped into Captain Murray, his immediate superior. What's the latest, Banks? Another family drama? Asked the captain, shoving his hands in his pockets. Looks like it, sir. A wife shot her husband after finding out he had infected her with HIV. Murray shook his head. Classify it as manslaughter or killing in the heat of passion. The district attorney won't want to make a big deal out of it, especially under these circumstances. She's already had enough bad luck. But something bothered Jamal. Perhaps it was a professional habit to dig deeper than necessary. He returned to his desk and laid out the photos from the crime scene. 8 shots. Not 1, not 2, all 8. That took some determination, even in the heat of the moment. The phone on his desk rang. It was a patrol officer. Detective Banks? We just brought in Chanel Jackson, the suspect's daughter. She came home from work and is demanding to see her mother. A tall, thin girl was pacing nervously in the waiting room. Her pigtails were pulled back into a high ponytail. Her store uniform was wrinkled, and her eyes were filled with fear and anger. Where's my mom? What happened to her? She lunged at Jamal as soon as he appeared in the doorway. Miss Jackson, I'm Detective Banks. Your mother is in custody. I'm afraid I have bad news. Your stepfather is dead. Chanel froze, her face expressionless, showing neither grief nor surprise. Did she kill him? The girl asked after a pause. Banks nodded. It was about time, Chanel whispered, sinking into a chair. That bastard deserved every bullet. Did you know about the problems in their marriage? The detective asked cautiously. Problems? The girl smiled bitterly. Lamont was a walking problem. He drank, cheated, and raised his hand to his mother. She put up with it for the money. Without his salary, we couldn't afford the apartment. But after what happened last week... She stopped, as if she had said too much. What happened last week? Banks asked quickly. Nothing. Chanel shook her head. Just another fight. Can I see my mom? Jamal nodded to the officer who led the girl to the interrogation room. Left alone, the detective went over the evidence again. Maybe the captain was right, and this was just another sad story from a poor neighborhood. But Banks's intuition told him that it wasn't that simple. He looked through the contents of Keisha Jackson's bag again. Among the motel receipts was one dated last week. Underneath it was a receipt for pawn shop services for gold earrings pawned 2 weeks ago. The amount paid column showed the figure $300. That was a lot of money for a family barely making ends meet. $300. Enough for a full tank of gas, a night in a motel, and maybe a gun. Although there was already a gun in the house, Keisha had said so herself. Jamal put the receipt aside and rubbed his eyes. It was 3 a.m, too late for clear thinking. Tomorrow he would talk to Lamont's friends, check his medical records, maybe find this mysterious Roxy. Right now, he should go home and get some sleep. But as he left the station, Banks couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else to the case of Keisha and Lamont Jackson, some detail that was slipping through the cracks, something that turned a banal tragedy into something darker and more complicated. The morning at the Santa Monica police station began with the usual hustle and bustle. Detective Jamal Banks, who had spent the night on an uncomfortable couch in the break room, washed his face with cold water in the bathroom, trying to wash the fatigue from his face. The mirror mercilessly reflected the bags under his eyes and his graying stubble. 45 years old, 15 of them on the force, were beginning to take their toll. He dried his face with a paper towel and headed for his desk. The coroner's reports were already in the Jackson case file. 8 gunshot wounds, 6 of them fatal. Time of death between 10 o'clock and 11 p.m. The bullets had been removed, all fired from the same gun, presumably the one found at the crime scene. "Coffee, detective?" asked Officer Rodriguez, passing by and holding out a steaming cup. "Thanks, Maria." Banks nodded, gratefully accepting the drink. "Is the suspect awake yet?" "Yes. She was taken to the interrogation room half an hour ago. The public defender is already with her." Jamal nodded, gathered his papers, and headed for the interrogation room. Muffled voices could be heard through the door. Keisha Jackson and her public defender, a young man with tired eyes and a cheap suit, were discussing their defense strategy. Keisha looked different from yesterday. The shock had been replaced by grim determination. She sat up straight, her hands folded on the table, and looked at the detective who entered without fear. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson," Banks began, turning on the tape recorder and laying out his papers. "Mr. Ramirez," the lawyer introduced himself. "Jose Ramirez, public defender. Before we begin, I would like to know what charges my client is facing." "At this point, second-degree murder," Jamal replied, "but that may change depending on the results of the investigation." Mrs. Jackson gave her preliminary statement last night. The lawyer nodded and whispered something to Keisha. She just shook her head and turned to the detective. "I'll tell you everything. Again. From the beginning." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I've been working as a cleaner at Food Mart supermarket for 6 years. Lamont started there as a stalker shortly after it opened. We met at a Christmas party. He was different then. Caring. Attentive. He said I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met." She smiled sadly, looking at her hands with bitten nails and cracked skin from constant contact with cleaning products. "We got married a year later. Chanel, my daughter from my first marriage, was against it at first, but Lamont knew how to be charming when he wanted to. The first 2 years were okay, not perfect, but tolerable. Then he started drinking. At first, just a little on the weekends, then more and more often. He started disappearing, not coming home at night. Money was disappearing from our budget." Keisha paused, gathering her thoughts. 2 weeks ago, our supermarket announced mandatory medical examinations for all employees. Insurance covered basic tests, including HIV. I had my blood taken, like everyone else. And 3 days ago, the results came back. Her voice faltered. Positive. I couldn't believe it. I double-checked. It wasn't a mistake. I have HIV. The only man in my life for the last 5 years is Lamont. He's the only one who could have given it to me. Banks nodded, taking notes. Last night I was waiting for him at home. Chanel was working the night shift. I made dinner, wanting to talk calmly. He came home around 9, already drunk. I showed him the results. Do you know what he did? He laughed. He said I must be sleeping with someone else because no one in their right mind would fuck someone like me. Keisha clenched her fists so hard that her knuckles turned white. I started screaming, demanding the truth, and then he confessed. He said he'd known about his diagnosis for over a year. He knew and continued to sleep with other women, and with me, without protection. The lawyer put his hand on his client's shoulder, but she shook it off. He said, "Big deal. We're all going to die sooner or later." And he went to the kitchen to get a beer. I remembered his gun. Lamont bought it second-hand a couple of years ago. For protection, he said. He kept it in the nightstand by his bed. I took it out and I shot him. I don't remember how many times. I don't remember anything after the first shot. I came to when it was all over. Banks looked at her closely, trying to detect any falsehood, but her story sounded sincere. The pain and despair in her voice seemed genuine. Did you know about the other women? He asked. Names? Addresses? Just the name of one of them, Roxy. I found a note from her in his jacket a month ago. He denied everything, of course, said it was some kind of mistake. Was the gun registered? Keisha shook her head. I don't think so. He bought it on the street. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to get a legal gun with a criminal record. A criminal record? Jamal asked, alert. Yes, for assault. Before we met. He served 6 months. The lawyer leaned over his client again and whispered something. She nodded and turned to the detective. I want to admit my guilt. Second-degree murder or manslaughter, whatever the prosecutor says. I don't deny that I shot him, but I was out of my mind. Finding out that the man you trusted had condemned you to death, it drives you crazy. Jamal closed his notebook and turned off the tape recorder. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Jackson. We'll have more questions, but that's all for now. Leaving the room, he headed for his desk. Keisha's story was logical and supported by evidence. Murder in the heat of passion, provoked by the victim's violent and irresponsible behavior. The district attorney would probably offer a deal, a guilty plea in exchange for a minimum sentence, possibly even probation. But something still bothered Banks. 8 shots, a full magazine. That required a certain amount of determination. He opened the police database and checked Lamont Jackson's criminal record. Sure enough, 7 years ago, he had assaulted his ex-girlfriend. 6 months in county jail. After his release, he was on probation for 2 years, which he completed without incident. The next step was to study the victim's medical records. Jamal called the clinic where Keisha had been tested and, using his position, requested information about Lamont Jackson. An hour later, the fax machine spat out the documents he needed. Lamont was indeed HIV positive. He had been diagnosed a year and 3 months ago. The doctor had prescribed antiretroviral therapy, but according to the records, the patient had been irregularly attending appointments and often missed taking his medication. So she's telling the truth, Banks muttered as he studied the documents. He decided to talk to Lamont's friends and colleagues. The file contained the contact information of his closest friend, Tyrone Gaines, who worked as a security guard at the same supermarket. An hour later, Jamal was sitting in a small cafe near Food Mart, where he had arranged to meet Tyrone. He showed up right on time, a tall, middle-aged man with short hair and a wary look. He was wearing a security guard's uniform, apparently straight from work. "Detective Banks?" he asked, approaching the table. "Yes, please sit down, Mr. Gaines." Jamal nodded. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Tyrone sat down awkwardly, his large hands nervously fingering his coffee cup. "I heard what happened to Lamont," he began. "That's terrible. We were friends for 10 years since school." "I'm sorry for your loss," Banks replied standardly. "I need to ask you a few questions about Mr. Jackson. What was his relationship with his wife like? Tyrone shrugged. Like everyone else's, I guess. They had their fights, they had their good days. Keisha is a good woman, a hard worker, but Lamont, he was a complicated man. Complicated in what way? Well, he liked to drink, go out. He lived for the moment. He didn't think about the consequences. Did he cheat on his wife? Jamal asked bluntly. Tyrone looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Look, I don't want to speak ill of a dead friend. Lamont was a good guy at heart. He just had his weaknesses. Mr. Gaines, your friend is dead and his wife is accused of murder. This isn't the time for beating around the bush. Tyrone sighed and nodded. Yes, he had other women. Several. He didn't hide it from me. He said he was bored with Keisha, that she was too proper, too boring. He wanted excitement, thrills. Do you know these women? Names, addresses? One for sure. Roxy Williams. She's a bartender at the Blue Moon on Lincoln Boulevard. Lamont met her there about 6 months ago. There were others, but I don't know their names. He didn't go into much detail. Banks made a note. Find this Roxy. Talk to her. What do you know about Lamont's health? Tyrone tensed. What do you mean? Did he have any serious illnesses? Was he taking any medication? No, not that I know of. Gaines replied too quickly, and Jamal knew he was lying. Just the usual colds, nothing serious. Mr. Gaines, Banks leaned toward him. We have Lamont's medical records. We know about his HIV status. The question is, did you know? Tyrone was silent for a long time, as if weighing all his options. Finally, he sighed heavily. Yes, I knew. He told me about a year ago. He was in shock, drunk out of his mind. I took him home and put him to bed on my couch. He swore he'd tell Keisha and start treatment. I believed him. But he didn't tell her, Jamal asked. No. He said he was afraid of her reaction, that she might leave him. And then it was as if he had come to terms with it. He said that with modern medication, he could live a long time, that he didn't want to destroy his family. I believed that he was at least using protection with his wife and others. But that wasn't the case. Tyrone lowered his eyes. I don't know, I really don't know. We hadn't been talking much lately. He started to distance himself, started skipping our traditional beer nights. He was kind of jumpy, nervous, especially in the last few months. Do you know if he had any problems? Debts? Threats? Maybe. He mentioned once that he needed money, fast. But he didn't say why. I offered to help, but he refused. He said he'd take care of it himself. Jamal made a few more notes in his notebook and handed Tyrone his business card. If you remember anything else, give me a call, and let me know when the funeral is. I'll need to be there. Tyrone nodded, tucking the card into his shirt pocket. You know, Detective, whatever happened, whatever Lamont did, he didn't deserve to die like that. No one does. After meeting with Tyrone, Banks headed back to the station. On the way, he pondered the information he had received. With each new piece of evidence, the story became clearer and more understandable. Lamont Jackson was an irresponsible husband with a history of violence who had infected his wife with a deadly disease and showed no remorse. Keisha was a woman driven to despair who snapped when she realized she had been betrayed. Chanel Jackson, Keisha's daughter, was waiting for him at the station. The girl sat in the waiting area, nervously tapping her foot on the floor. When she saw the detective, she jumped up. Can I see my mom? I was told I need your permission. Soon, Jamal nodded. First, I'd like to talk to you if you don't mind. They settled into a small witness room. Chanel was tense but held herself with dignity despite her young age. Tell me about your stepfather, Banks asked. What was your relationship like? The girl snorted. None. I put up with him for my mother's sake, that's all. When they first met, he acted like the perfect man. Flowers, compliments, help around the house. As soon as they got married, the mask came off. The real Lamont was a selfish, lazy jerk who thought the world owed him everything. Was he violent? Towards you or your mother? Chanel paused as if deciding how much to reveal. Towards my mother, yes. I saw bruises several times. She made excuses, saying she'd hit the door or fallen, the usual excuses. He didn't touch me. He knew I wouldn't keep quiet. Did you know about his affairs? Of course. The whole neighborhood knew. He didn't even try to hide it. My mom just turned a blind eye. She was afraid of being left alone, without money. Our apartment is expensive for this neighborhood, and my mom's salary barely covers half the rent. What happened last week? Jamal asked, remembering the girl's remark from yesterday. You mentioned some kind of incident. Chanel tensed up. Nothing special, just another fight. Chanel, I'm trying to help your mother. Now is not the time for secrets. The girl sighed and ran her hand through her hair. Lamont came home drunk as usual. He started yelling that Mom was a bad cook, a bad housekeeper, that she was good for nothing. I stepped in and told him to shut up. He swung at me. Mom got between us and he hit her, hard in the face with his fist. I wanted to call the police, but my mom wouldn't let me. She said she'd deal with it herself. When exactly did this happen? Last Wednesday, around 10 o'clock at night. The next day, my mom went to the clinic for a medical examination. Banks made a note. A timeline was beginning to take shape. Did you know about your mother's diagnosis? About the HIV? Chanel nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She told me 2 days ago. She was desperate. She said she didn't know how to go on. I suggested we leave, start over in another city. We could make it work together. But she seemed to have made up her mind. She became calmer, more confident. She said she would take care of everything. Did you ask her what she meant? No, I thought... The girl hesitated. I thought she was going to file for divorce, maybe report him to the police for assault. I didn't know that it would turn out like this. Jamal could see that Chanel was telling the truth, or at least what she believed to be the truth. You can see your mother now. The officer will take you there. After the girl left, Banks returned to examining the gun. The weapon was indeed unregistered. Keisha's fingerprints were clear on the handle and trigger. There were no signs of a struggle on the victim's body, which meant that Lamont had not resisted and probably did not expect to be attacked. But something still bothered the detective. He took the crime scene photos out of the folder and studied them again carefully. Lamont's body was lying face up, arms spread out to the sides. There were 8 bullet holes in his chest and stomach, grouped fairly close together. Even in a state of shock, it required a certain amount of concentration. One of the photos showed a coffee table with papers scattered around it, bills, receipts, reminders of overdue payments, and among them was a small photograph that Jamal hadn't noticed yesterday in the commotion. He enlarged the image on his computer. It was a family photo, Keisha, Lamont, and Chanel, all smiling on the beach. Judging by the clothes and the lighting, it was summer, probably last summer or the summer before. They looked happy, at least in the photo. What had gone wrong? When had this ordinary family turned into a battlefield? Jamal leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Keisha's story was corroborated by all the evidence, and yet something didn't add up. Some small detail was slipping his attention. He returned to the case files. The gun belonged to Lamont, although it wasn't officially registered. Tyrone confirmed that the victim had a gun for self-defense. Keisha knew about the gun and where it was kept. In a moment of emotional turmoil, she grabbed the gun and shot her husband. A classic crime of passion. But 8 shots. 8 accurate shots to the torso, without a single miss. For someone who had never fired a gun before, it was strange. Banks decided to check if Keisha had any experience with guns. A quick search of the database yielded no results. No license, no self-defense courses, no membership in shooting clubs. Maybe it was just a coincidence? Or did the adrenaline rush in a moment of stress sharpen her reflexes? Possibly. But still. Jamal reviewed the case files once more. He reconstructed the chronology of events. Keisha's medical examination, her diagnosis, the conflict with Lamont, the murder. Everything was logical, everything was connected. No contradictions or inconsistencies. But why now? Why, after so many years of enduring betrayal and insults, did Keisha snap now? Of course, the news of her HIV infection was extremely stressful. But was that the only reason? Captain Murray looked into the office, interrupting the detective's thoughts. Well, Banks, have you cleared up the Jackson case? Almost, sir. I'm gathering the last details. Don't drag it out. The district attorney is waiting for our report. It looks like a clear case of passion. The husband infected his wife with HIV, she snapped. The jury will be on her side. She won't even need a lawyer. I understand, sir. I just want to be sure I'm not missing anything important. Murray shrugged. It's your call, but don't dig too deep where you don't need to. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and a crime of passion is just a crime of passion. After the captain left, Jamal returned to his thoughts. Maybe Murray was right. Maybe he was complicating a simple case because of professional paranoia. 15 years on the force had taught him to look for a catch even where there wasn't one. And yet, something bothered him. Some detail, some touch that didn't fit into the overall picture. He reviewed Keisha's testimony, the expert reports, and the neighbors' statements once again. Everything pointed to her telling the truth. Then why was his intuition screaming danger? Why was the inner voice that had saved him countless times over the years now insisting that he was missing something? Jamal decided to take another look at the Jacksons' apartment. Perhaps he would find answers to his questions there, or at least confirmation that there were no questions to be asked. The Jacksons' apartment greeted Detective Banks with stale air and silence. The police tape on the door was a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded here 2 days ago. Jamal put on gloves and methodically began to examine the apartment, now without rushing, thoughtfully studying every detail. Nothing new in the living room. The bloodstains had already dried, forming dark spots on the linoleum. Lamont's body had been taken away, leaving behind only chalk outlines. 8 shots, 8 holes in the chest and stomach. Not a single miss. The kitchen was small and cramped, with cheap furniture and outdated appliances. On the refrigerator were magnets with the names of cheap diners and a photo of Chanel in her prom dress. On the table was a stack of unpaid bills. Banks carefully examined each document: an electricity bill with a warning about disconnection, a late rent notice, a receipt from a pawn shop for a pair of earrings, the same $300 he had noticed earlier, and another document he had missed the first time: an insurance policy in the name of Lamont Jackson, life insurance for $50,000. The beneficiary was Keisha Jackson. The date of issue was 3 weeks ago. Jamal's heart began to beat faster. He photographed the document and sent the image to himself. $50,000 was a fortune for the Jackson family, more than their annual income. The bedroom was in the same state of disarray as it had been 2 days ago, clothes scattered everywhere, dresser drawers pulled out. Banks sat down on the edge of the bed and thought, what was he missing? What piece of the puzzle was still missing? Next to the bedside table lay a woman's handbag, which he had already examined on the day of the murder. But now, with a new suspicion, he decided to check it again. In addition to the items he already knew about, cosmetics, a wallet, keys, he found a small notebook in the side pocket. It contained phone numbers, shopping notes, and to-do lists, and one entry made about a month ago. Clinic, 8 in the morning. Don't forget ID and insurance. And below it, in a different pen, positive. Repeat test in a week. Jamal took a photo of the page and continued his search. In the bathroom, behind the mirror, he found several bottles of pills. One of them caught his attention, a prescription drug with a long name. Banks wasn't a pharmacist, but he decided to check. A quick internet search confirmed his suspicions. It was an antiretroviral drug used to treat HIV infection. The date on the label was a month ago. The patient's name was Keisha Jackson. The picture was starting to come together, but with a completely different plot than originally expected. Back at the station, Jamal requested Keisha Jackson's phone records for the past 3 months. While waiting for the operator's response, he called Tyrone Gaines and arranged another meeting. This time, they met at a small bar near the auto repair shop where Tyrone worked after his day job. He looked tired and wary. "What else do you want to know, detective?" he asked, taking a sip of his beer. "I already told you everything I know." "Not everything." Banks shook his head. "You said Lamont had been acting nervous lately, distancing himself from you. You didn't mention that he was planning to leave Keisha." Tyrone's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you—" "Just a guess," Jamal lied. "Which you just confirmed." Tyrone sighed and put down his mug. "Yes, he was. About a month ago, he said he'd had enough, that he couldn't live with Keisha anymore, that she was suffocating him. He said he'd met a woman who understood him, who accepted him for who he was, even with his problem." "HIV?" "Yes, this woman, Roxy, she's a nurse at an HIV clinic. They met there when Lamont went in for an appointment. She's been HIV positive for several years, but she's living a normal life with medication." "He was going to leave her?" "Yes, He was looking for an apartment, saving money. He wanted to start over with a clean slate. He said he was almost there. Did Keisha know about this? Tyrone shrugged. I don't know. Lamont didn't tell her directly, but they lived together. Maybe she noticed something, suspected something. What about their joint savings? Did they have a joint account? Yeah, about $8,000. They were saving for a down payment on a house, dreaming of moving out of their rented apartment. Lamont said he'd take the money when he left. He felt he was entitled to it. Most of it was from his salary, after all. Jamal made a note in his notebook. Another motive. What about insurance? Did Lamont say anything about life insurance? Tyrone thought for a moment. Yeah, I think so. Keisha insisted he get a policy. She said with his job, lifting heavy stuff, working in cold storage, you never know what could happen. He agreed, though he grumbled that it was a waste of money. When was that? 3 weeks ago, maybe a month, not long before he decided to quit. Jamal nodded, piecing together a timeline in his head. Everything was starting to make sense. Thank you, Mr. Gaines. You've been very helpful. Back at the station, Banks found that the call records he had requested had already arrived. He carefully studied Keisha's contact list for the past few months. Lots of calls to work, to her daughter, to utility companies, and regular calls to the same clinic, the one where Lamont was being treated for HIV. The first call was 2 months earlier. Jamal called the clinic and, using his position, requested information about Keisha Jackson's visits. The employee reluctantly confirmed that Mrs. Jackson had been their patient for about 2 months. She had been diagnosed with HIV at the same time. She had been seeing the doctor regularly and receiving medication. Was her husband, Lamont Jackson, also a patient of yours? Banks asked. Yes, but he came in on different days. As far as I know, he and his wife didn't know about each other's diagnoses. At least, that's what Dr. Morgan said. The next step was to check pharmacies in the area. If Keisha had indeed been diagnosed 2 months ago, she should have been taking her medication regularly. After calling several pharmacies near the Jacksons' home, Jamal found the one where Keisha regularly bought her medication. Yes, Mrs. Jackson comes in about once every 2 weeks, the pharmacist confirmed. Always the same prescription from Dr. Morgan. Do you have surveillance cameras? Banks asked. Of course, this is a pharmacy. We keep the recordings for the last 3 months. I need the footage from her last visit. It's for a police investigation. An hour later, Jamal was sitting at the station, watching the surveillance video. The footage from last week clearly showed Keisha buying her prescription. She looked calm, even smiling at the pharmacist. There were no signs of shock or despair, emotions that a person should feel after learning of a terminal diagnosis. The puzzle was almost complete. The final piece was the financial trail. Banks requested the Jacksons' bank statements for the past 3 months, and he found what he was looking for, a $10,000 loan taken out by Keisha 2 months ago. Around the same time she found out about her diagnosis. Captain Murray was surprised by the new information. Are you saying she planned all this? He asked incredulously, looking over the evidence Jamal had gathered. That's right, sir. Banks nodded. Keisha found out about her HIV status 2 months ago. She most likely contracted it from her husband, who already knew about his diagnosis at that time. But instead of confronting him, she decided to take action. She took out a loan, took out life insurance on her husband, and began to prepare. But why wait? Why not kill him right away? Perhaps at first she really just wanted a divorce. But then she found out that Lamont was planning to leave and take their savings with him, so she decided to get ahead of him. Murray shook his head. That changes things. Instead of murder in the heat of passion, it's premeditated first-degree murder. Yes, sir. With aggravating circumstances, financial gain. Talk to her again. Present the evidence. See what she says. Keisha Jackson sat in the interrogation room with the same impassive expression she had worn on the first day. Next to her was her lawyer, the same young Ramirez, looking even more tired than before. Mrs. Jackson, Banks began, laying out photos and documents in front of her. We found some discrepancies in your story. He laid out the insurance policy. You took out a life insurance policy on your husband 3 weeks before he died. Then there's this bank statement. You took out a loan for $10,000 2 months ago. And finally, these medical records and surveillance footage from a pharmacy. You knew about your HIV status for at least 2 months, not 3 days, as you previously claimed. Keisha looked at the documents without surprise or fear. Only a slight smile touched her lips. So what? She asked. That doesn't prove anything. It does, Mrs. Jackson, Jamal objected. It proves premeditation. You didn't act in the heat of the moment. You planned your husband's murder so you could collect his insurance and prevent him from taking your joint savings. The lawyer leaned toward his client and whispered something in her ear, but she waved him away. You don't understand, detective, she said bitterly. Yes, I knew about my diagnosis for 2 months. I found out by accident when I had a routine blood test. It was a shock. I never cheated on Lamont. Never. And she clenched her fists. I asked him directly if he had HIV. He denied everything. He swore he was healthy, that I must have caught it from someone else. He accused me of cheating on him, yelled that I was a whore, and then I checked his medication. I found the same pills I was taking. He knew, and continued to infect other women. Keisha fell silent, and Jamal took advantage of the pause. Why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you file for divorce? What would Chanel and I live on? My salary is barely enough to feed us, the woman said bitterly. The apartment, the bills, Lamont paid for all of that. I tried to find a part-time job, took extra shifts, and then I found out he was going to leave me for that barmaid, Roxy, and take our savings, $8,000 we'd saved for 5 years, the money I planned to spend on treatment. So you took out a loan and took out insurance on it? Yes. I knew he wouldn't leave me anything. I had to take care of myself and my daughter. HIV isn't a death sentence these days, but the medication is expensive, and Chanel is going to college. Jamal looked at her closely, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. And it seemed like this time, she was. What happened that night? Did you really confront him about his diagnosis? Keisha shook her head. No, I already knew about his diagnosis. I knew about his plans to leave. That evening, I showed him the bank statement, our savings. I told him we needed that money for treatment, for Chanel's future. He laughed. He said he would take every penny, that I didn't deserve $1 after all the years he had put up with such a cow, that he had found a real woman who appreciated him. Her voice trembled. I tried to explain that it was our money, that half of it belonged to me. He hit me. He said I wouldn't get anything, that I would die in poverty like I deserved. Then he went to the kitchen to get a beer, and then You took the gun and shot him. Jamal finished for her. Yes, 8 times. I counted every shot, one for every year he abused me, for every time I forgave his betrayal, for every time I endured his beatings, and the last one was for the HIV that will be with me for the rest of my life. The room fell silent. Attorney Ramirez looked dejected. His simple case of manslaughter had turned into a complex case of premeditated murder. You understand that you will now be tried for first-degree murder? Banks asked. With aggravating circumstances, financial gain. Keisha shrugged. I'm going to die before I get out anyway. Even with medication, HIV shortens your life. And Chanel will get the insurance money and my savings. She'll be able to go to college and build a normal life. It was worth the risk. Jamal shook his head. He couldn't help but admire her coolness and determination, even if they were directed toward such a terrible act. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jackson, but the law is the law. Leaving the interrogation room, Banks headed for his desk to file the paperwork. The Jackson case turned out to be much more complicated than it had initially seemed. It wasn't just a family drama that had come to a tragic end, but the cold calculation of a woman driven to despair. Captain Murray stopped at his desk. Well, Banks, is everything clear? Yes, sir, she confessed. Premeditated murder. Good work, but what a sad story. 2 broken people, 2 ruined lives. Jamal nodded, gathering the documents into a folder. He thought of Chanel, who would now be left alone, of Keisha, who would spend the rest of her life in prison, of Lamont, whose irresponsible behavior had set off this chain of tragic events. There are no winners in cases like this, only losers. Later that evening, When Keisha Jackson was officially arrested for first-degree murder, Jamal watched her being led out of the station. She walked with her head held high, without tears or remorse. Her eyes showed only the calmness of someone who knew what she was getting into and was ready to accept the consequences. At the other end of the hallway stood Chanel, her face contorted with pain and confusion. Keisha paused for a moment, looked at her daughter, and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Banks turned away. It was the end of a story that began as a typical case of murder in the heat of passion and ended as a grim drama of revenge and despair. It was the story of a woman who, driven to despair by life and illness, decided to take control in the only way she knew how. He closed the Jackson case file and placed it in his desk drawer. Tomorrow he would hand over all the materials to the district attorney. Preparations for the trial would begin, with witness interviews and expert examinations. The usual routine of justice. But today, watching Keisha Jackson's receding figure, Jamal Banks felt only fatigue and a vague understanding that the line between victim and criminal is sometimes too blurred.